final announcements because we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. to welcome you to this 5th Economic Growth Forum. On behalf of the Ministry of Finance and our partners, the IGC, I want to welcome you and now request that we all be upstanding for the anthems. We'll have the Uganda National Anthem and the East African Anthem. So if we could all stand for the anthems, please. Take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable State Minister for Planning in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the Honorable Amos Lugolovi, the Permanent Secretary and Secretary to the Treasury, Ramadan Ngobi, our Deputy Governor, Bank of Uganda, Michael Atengiego, the UN Resident Coordinator, the IMF country representative. This is where normally protocol is very difficult, but I'll try. The members of parliament present, and I did see some arriving a short while ago. Dr. Richard Newfarmer, the Country Director, IGC, and Professor Jonathan Leap, who is the Executive Director, IGC, who are all joining us virtually. Our heads of the different MDAs. I did see our friend Joseph Muvawala here from the National Planning Authority. I did see our sister Lilia Jarova from Uganda Tourism Board. And also here, your Honorable Minister with us is the Executive Director, Private Sector Foundation, Uganda, Sivina Simwe. But also with us is the Chair, I don't know if the Executive Director, Uganda Bankers Association, who is also here with us, and several other heads of agencies and different departments of government. So ladies and gentlemen, you're most welcome to this Economic Growth Forum. We are looking at economic resilience, recovery and resurgent growth. And I want to welcome all of you who are here, those joining us physically in this room here at the Kampala Serena Hotel, and those joining us virtually. And we do have several presentations that will also come to us virtually. I want to welcome the audience watching us on Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, UBC, and NBS. We want to welcome you to this very important conversation, a conversation on recovery, 2 years of the pandemic, or amidst the pandemic that's still here with us. As you may be aware, our very fast economic growth numbers in the last 4 years came to a halt at the beginning of 2020. And as a country, and as a region, and as a continent, we continue to learn new ways of doing things. And today's conversation is among that, and looking forward to great conversations. I want to invite the Permanent Secretary, because he chairs the next session, to invite the Honourable Minister to make opening remarks. So, PS, please come. For this part, you're only inviting the Minister, and then we'll continue. You're welcome, sir. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Maurice. The Honourable Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, holding that portfolio now, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, all the protocols. I see so many big people in the room. Greetings to you all, and you are welcome to this important conversation, as Maurice has told us. Honorable Minister, you are welcome to address and open up this wonderful conversation.
The Permanent Secretary and Secretary Treasury, Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the Deputy Governor, Bank of Uganda, Honorable Members of Parliament, I'm sorry about that, the protocol issue, the head IMF, the Director the handwriting here is beating me. But to you all, our participants, both here and online, all protocol observed. I think let me play it safe. I'm here at the 5th Economic Growth Forum with the theme Economic Resilience, Recovery, and Resurgent Growth. In my capacity as the Minister of State for Finance, Planning and Economic Development, in charge of planning but also holding the portfolio of the Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, who is unable to be here today because he's out of the country on other state duties, but he conveys his apologies. I take this opportunity to warmly welcome all participants to this year's Economic Growth Forum. We are hosting our 5th EGF, having had the first one in 2017, and making this an annual event underscores the importance of Growth Forum and its invaluable contribution to Uganda's development agenda. This is the second EGF under the dark cloud of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected all countries, including Uganda. While every death is a tragedy, allow me to say that the death toll in Uganda has been much lower than what we see in many other countries. And we must congratulate our President and all of us. Despite this, the effect of the pandemic on our economy has been severe. From a robust growth rate of 6.4% in financial year 2018-2019, real GDP growth fell sharply to 3% in financial year 2019-2020, dampened by the onset of the pandemic and the restrictions imposed to curb the spread of coronavirus. The financial year 2020-21 saw only a modest increase in real GDP growth at 3.4%, which continued to reflect the adverse impact of the pandemic and related restrictions. Despite this economic downturn, allow me to point out that Uganda fared much better than most countries in the region, some of which have suffered negative growth during this unprecedented economic downturn. The economy is projected to grow by 3.8% in this financial year, 2021-2022. This continued recovery in economic activity illustrates the resilience of Uganda's economy and its people. However, Uganda needs to achieve and sustain much higher growth than this to realize our medium to long-term development aspirations, such as the attainment of the middle-income status. Moreover, the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic led to some losses in the socio-economic gains that we have achieved over the last decade, meaning that we need high and sustained growth to bring back some of these losses. As a government, we have taken steps to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on the lives and livelihoods of Ugandans. We have recently taken steps to fully reopen the economy while vaccinating millions of Ugandans to reduce the need for lockdowns in the future. Although we are aware that the emergence of new variants remains a real possibility, the health and economic impact of such variants will be significantly less severe than what we have experienced over the last 18 months. We now know a lot more about this virus. We now have vaccines, and medical practitioners have become much better at treating the disease. We now have better infrastructure, etc. Climate change is yet another problem we are facing. The world has now accepted that human activities have had a devastating impact on the environment, and the rising global temperatures could change life on Earth as we know it. Adverse weather events have already increased in their severity and frequency. Countries like Uganda, despite contributing very little to this problem, will bear the worst consequences of climate change. Our dependence on agriculture, whose share is nearly 1/4 of our GDP, leaves us very vulnerable to this phenomenon. Like many countries, Uganda must devise ways to cope with this inevitable change in weather patterns to minimize the impact of climate change on our society. As with COVID-19, the world must come together to devise a common strategy to halt and reverse the rise in global temperatures. Failure to do this means we will suffer adverse effects, since the weather, like the coronavirus, does not respect national borders. The emergence of COVID-19 variants has shown us that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. We would do well to learn this lesson and apply it to the issue of climate change. It is against this backdrop that we have convened some of the leading experts in the different areas to attend this growth forum. I hope to benefit from your rich ideas on how Uganda can deal with these and other challenges that affect the economic transformation we aim to achieve. I'm confident that, as in previous growth fora, we shall generate excellent ideas for government to incorporate into its development strategy for next year and the medium term. As I conclude, allow me to express my sincere gratitude to our very important partners in the Economic Growth Forum, namely the International Growth Center, the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the UK Aid. We attach much value to our partnership with you and are very grateful for your continued support and goodwill. May I propose that we give them a round of applause. It is now my singular honor and pleasure to declare this 5th Economic Growth Forum officially open for God and my country.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for the Honorable Minister. Thank you very much for opening our forum this morning. And may I also now invite from the International Growth Center, the Executive Director, Jonathan Lip, to speak to us. Jonathan is joining us via Zoom, so we'll turn our attentions to the screen for Jonathan's remarks. Jonathan, if you can hear me, over to you, sir.
To the Treasury, Deputy Governor, Commissioner, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for your kind words, Minister. It's a distinct pleasure to extend your welcome on behalf of the International Growth Centre and our main funder, the UK, FCDO. This, as you said, is the 5th Economic Growth Forum that the Ministry of Finance has undertaken with the support of the IGC. And I think it's a testament to the seriousness with which the government of Uganda welcomes new ideas and draws on economic research and evidence in making policy. This is, I believe, one of the reasons Uganda has consistently ranked in the top tier of best performing economies in Africa. The themes of this conference, economic recovery, resilience, and resurgent growth, could not be more apt. It's important that Uganda's recovery take firm hold, lift incomes, and provide new job opportunities coming out of the devastation of the global pandemic recession in 2020. Indeed, IGC studies indicate that 2020 was particularly devastating to the poor, with poverty rates in Uganda increasing to levels not seen in the last decade. The good news is that appropriate policies have produced a rapid rebound. From deep recession in 2020, the economy returned to growth, and growth is projected to climb over 6% by next year. But generating recovery is not the same as putting in place the conditions for resilience and sustained growth. The topics considered in today's conference, job creation and inclusivity, trade and climate change, are crucial to sustaining high growth and ensuring it is both resilient and inclusive. There's a common idea underlying today's sessions. Let me share with you a picture. The graph you see shows the relationship between productivity on the vertical axis and the per capita incomes on the horizontal axis. Increases in total factor productivity measure the increase in a country's capacity to produce goods and services for the same amount of labor, capital, and raw materials. And the figure shows that these productivity increases drive increases in incomes. Note first how the figure for Uganda, circled here in red, compares favorably with that in some other African countries, including Tanzania and Zambia. But notice also how Uganda compares with Ireland at the very top of the graph. What this comparison shows is that what a worker in Uganda can produce in a week, a worker in Ireland with the same value of capital and inputs can produce in a day. The Irish worker is no more talented than the Ugandan worker, but he's better trained, he works in a firm with more efficient management and better business processes, and with machines that embody superior technology. Rising incomes are driven by two fundamental growth dynamics. The first is increases in the productivity of individuals through education and training, and of firms through investments and innovations in technology and management. The second is shifting people out of low productivity activities, such as subsistence agriculture and street trading, into activities where they can be more productive. It's a recognition of these core growth dynamics that drive many of the policy recommendations we'll be discussing today. And they figure prominently in the volume that was launched yesterday at the Ministry of Finance. Let me now take a moment to highlight a few of the key issues we'll be discussing today. To begin with, job creation and inclusivity are crucial to recovery, resilience, and sustained growth. Driven by rapid population growth, about 75% of Ugandans today are below the age of 30, and 500,000 workers enter the labor force each year. Nearly 14% of Uganda's youth are unemployed, among the highest rates in Africa. Job creation is therefore a central challenge and requires policies to support both the demand side and the supply side of labor markets. On the demand side, the most powerful way to create jobs is to grow the economy. The volume launched yesterday covers a range of job-creating growth policies for Uganda, ranging from spurring private investment to reforming public investment. Recent international research has highlighted the importance of incorporating informal self-employed labor into firms, because it is firms that collectively can raise productivity gains through specialization. The discussion later today on strengthening SMEs by linking them to large firms by building supply chains is a key potential channel for policy. On the supply side, the near-term agenda is controlling the pandemic. Vaccine distribution here lags behind other countries in the region. Rwanda, for example, is 30% fully vaccinated, 10 times the level here in Uganda. Action on education is equally important. The August report of the National Planning Authority found that the extended school closure had led to half the students stopping to learn, and projected that 1/3 of students would not return to schools when they reopen, raising the prospect of a long-term negative impact on labor force productivity. Recent research in Uganda, discussed in the Ministry of Finance volume, has identified a set of reforms to strengthen the education system. including developing a continuous measure of assessment for basic primary level, and implementing SMS-based local monitoring programs to track teacher attendance. And we know well-designed vocational training and apprenticeships can yield improvements in employment outcomes. A second key issue is expanding trade, both exports and imports, which is central to the process of structural transformation and productivity growth. One common feature of growth accelerations around the world is the rapid expansion of exports. As with other small market economies, Uganda has to export to capture the productivity gains associated with economies of scale. Much more can be done, as Uganda's exports are still well below the average for other countries on similar levels of per capita income. The emergence of global supply chains opens new potential opportunities for Uganda to compete in export markets and to add value to its commodity exports. The pandemic-induced shift from just-in-time to just-in-case has created new opportunities for Africa, as international firms are now seeking to diversify their suppliers. African firms are still at the early stage of tapping into this potential. Helping domestic firms here to become suppliers of large exporters and foreign firms can lead to large productivity gains. But imports are just as important to rapid growth as exports. Imports provide much needed technologies and inputs to Uganda's productive sector. Recent IGC research found, for example, that imported inputs of just 2 large anchor firms in 1 year indirectly supplied 1,548 Ugandan enterprises. Ensuring firms have access to imported inputs is fundamental to drive competition and innovation. As the Minister mentioned, agriculture accounts for about a quarter of Uganda's GDP and employs almost 70% of its workforce. And agricultural commodities account for about half of Uganda's exports. Adding value to these commodities before they reach export markets is crucial, not only to boosting export earnings, but to generating more productive jobs. The African Continental Free Trade Area will provide new opportunities for African and Ugandan exporters. IGC researchers estimate that Ugandan exports could increase by as much as 20%. Recent IGC studies show that services trade is also important. Policies to be discussed in the trade session later today will shed light on the ways that Uganda can take advantage of the free trade area, can leverage its industrial parks, and create programs that link SMEs to large exporters and foreign firms. The third and final key issue I want to mention is making growth resilient in the face of climate change. As the Minister has noted, and the government recognized in its submission to the COP26 conference, climate change is a huge, if long-term, threat to Uganda and to developing countries everywhere. Uganda's agriculture, water, energy, fisheries, transportation, and forestry are all vulnerable. For example, rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns will not only cause water stress for large parts of the population, but it will also pose risks to the energy sector and to fisheries. It will make optimal growing seasons shorter, damaging the production of food crops, with estimated costs of up to 4% of GDP. Agriculture and urban transport offer 2 critical points of policy intervention that can promote adaptation and contribute to growth, while also mitigating emissions. For example, climate-induced losses for Arabica coffee production could add up to 50% by mid-century. So adopting new varieties of high-quality coffees and investing in forward processing can yield significant benefits. Adopting clean electric urban transport systems will reduce health-damaging pollution and spur more efficient and productive cities, while also reducing carbon emissions. As my colleague Robin Burgess will speak about later, climate change mitigation measures taken by rich countries may have significant effects on the economic prospects of developing countries. If wealthier countries shift to taxing the carbon emissions associated with consumption instead of production, as is now under discussion, the resulting external tariffs on carbon-intensive imports could damage Uganda's export revenues considerably if carbon emissions remain high. In closing, let me give special thanks to the Minister and to the PS and all our partners in the Ministry of Finance who have worked hard to put this conference together, as well as to the UK's FCDO, which has supported the work of the IGC for more than a decade. I also want to thank you, the in-person audience, and the participants from around the world who, like me, are joining virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and we are glad you could join us. We are hopeful next year you will physically join us, and so you can be part of this exciting moment and also find time in your visit to visit our national parks. That particular request is coming from the Uganda Tourism Board, so I've done my part in inviting you to Uganda. I also want to thank you for your very candid remarks on the impact of climate change, a conversation that we'll be having in our session. I think that's our one of our sessions immediately after the opening sessions, session 2, I think. But allow me now to invite Dr. Albert Musisi, Commissioner Macroeconomic Policy, Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, to take us through his presentation on Uganda's growth strategy, challenges and goals here in the Economic Growth Forum. So you're most welcome, Dr. Albert. Please come. And to you joining us virtually, you can share your comments in the same section there. We will be able to pick some of your comments and reactions in the following sessions. You're welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. The Economic Growth Forums, for me, my highlight of there because of what we discuss and how I see it affecting our growth policies in the ministry and also in government. As a way of introduction, my presentation is to set the scene for the discussions we are going to have later on today. And thank you. So as a way of introduction, I must say this is the 5th in a series of high-level economic growth forums, the ones we have been holding since 2017. And the objective of these forums, including this one, first of all, is to reflect on the state of the economy, how it is, and how we have seen happen, what we have seen happening in the past, and what we need to do to improve. We also provide evidence on economic growth performance in recent years, and as you'll see in my presentation, I'll be providing some evidence of how we have performed, what we have done well, and what we need to improve. And in this, of course, we also identify the opportunities and challenges that we are facing. And then we also identify key policy actions, actionable policy actions and strategies to drive accelerated and sustained inclusive growth in Uganda. For this reason, the focus and the key questions that we are going to look at, first of all, how can Uganda accelerate economic recovery and subsequently sustain high and inclusive economic growth in the face of the frequent internal and external shocks that we are facing? As the previous speaker pointed out, the number of shocks that we have faced, especially in the last decade. As you all know about the global financial crisis that we faced in 2008, although it affected us in 2011. Climate change, as I will be pointing out, that has affected our performance. The pandemics, this current COVID pandemic, the locust invasion, etc. So there are a number of them. So the questions that we are going to ask today are, what are the required policies and strategies to ensure that our economy remains resilient, especially against future shocks? How do we sustain the recovery we have already seen, or we are already seeing? And how do we ensure rapid growth to achieve middle income and even upper income status as envisioned in the Vision 2040. The primary goal of these forums is also to provide a policy framework and strategies to accelerate and sustain high economic growth for several decades. As I'm going to illustrate, this is actually the key challenge. You know, we have economies booming and busting, as they say, and that affects countries moving from the low income to middle income to upper income. Most of the countries actually stagnate lower and middle income levels. Very few countries actually move to upper income just because of this very problem, not being able to sustain high economic growth for a period enough to move them to the next level. We also want to provide strategies that ensure that growth is a means to development, not an end in itself. So that is growth that is going to result into productive employment, poverty reduction, and human development. This is what we have been talking about, socio-economic transformation. How do we achieve that? Then lastly, of course, the goal is to provide evidence, growth policies, and strategies to inform our national budget priorities. As I will illustrate later on, we have seen the impact already of this evidence, and we have influenced policies in government and in the national budget priorities. Okay, now, as I said, one of the key challenges is for countries to sustain that growth. Now, since the Second World War, only 13 economies, only 13 have sustained growth of more than 7% or more for 25 years or more. And you can see the list there. You can see that most of them managed to move to a higher per capita income from where they began. And the reason is because they managed to sustain this growth. Now, only Botswana from Africa is in that list. Although Uganda, we have done well ourselves, but we have not managed to join those 13 economies. And that's the challenge that we need to address. You can see that most of the countries in that list are actually Asian. They are mainly Asian, and we have seen the spectacular increase in their per capita incomes in the last few decades. Now they have moved to a higher level of income. This is data from the Commission on Growth and Development of Brookings University. Now, for Uganda, we have also we have not done so badly. For 19 years, we managed to grow at 7.3% from 1992 to 2011, financial year 2010-2011. And we also saw a spectacular rise, if I might call it that, from a per capita income of just 226 in 1991-92 to a per capita income of 894 US dollars. Now, that is more than tripling our per capita income during that period. But in the recent decade, that is the last one down there, we moved only to 954 US dollars per capita income, which means that we fell short of joining the middle income group, mainly because the level of growth that year, as you can see, in that decade on average was about 4.5%. And that explains the failure to actually meet our target that we had set ourselves to achieve. So we need to actually sustain the high growth rates. I want to demonstrate, as I say, the challenge is exactly sustaining the high growth rates. Now, I try to look at the differences between this period, and as you can see, in the period where we had an average of 7.3%, is also the period we had the fastest poverty reduction. This is the period which we call the PEEP period. And one of the things that I must say we did well there is effective and sustained economic reforms that we undertook during that period. But there were also a number of other factors that helped us. But you can see that the policies had some impact there. Now, the most recent period, that is what I call the NDP period, that's the last decade, there our average was only 4.5%. And we have to examine what happened there, and that's what I want to turn to. Now, if you look at this figure, in the last 10 years, this is showing our growth performance in the last 10 years. As you can see, before COVID, as the minister and also a few others have talked about, we had actually recovered from the low growth that we had before the 2 years that I show over there. We had an average of at least 6%. We are growing at 6.3% in 17, 18, and 18, 19. So, and that was a significant recovery from what we were doing the few years back, like the 5, 6 years before that period. So what happened there? What did we do? One of the reasons, of course, is that the agriculture sector recovered, partly because of better weather conditions, but also because of a number of measures that were undertaken following some of the discussions we had here. In agriculture, for example, the distribution of seeds helped a great deal, although there have been some criticism about the whole process. However, these have had major impact. Also, we increased the quality of those seeds. For example, the drought and pest-resistant seeds, particularly for coffee. The coffee sector performed very well, and it continues to perform very well even during this period of COVID. The coffee sector is doing very well. Also, food crops did very well, particularly maize, and we see it even in our exports, mainly to the neighboring countries. It was also helped, of course, by the demand from these countries because they had suffered some drought also. But we did very well. We produced a lot of maize and we exported it. There were a few other crops. Also, another thing that we may not be recognizing, or at least for us who have looked at it, the sector manufacturing performed also very well during those 2 years. And the main reason, or at least one of the reasons, was some of the government program that was undertaken, for example, the industrial park development. I know that many of you must have seen the Goodwill Ceramics company producing the tiles that we have seen from the Kapeka Industrial Park. This company started producing in 2018, but there are a few others that I'm not going to mention here. But also this period was a time when there was quite a bit of investment by government in the oil and gas sector, particularly the roads, the oil roads, but also the FDI, the foreign direct investment that came in from the private sector in the oil sector. So this is explaining much of this good recovery that we saw. However, as I've noted, it was rudely affected by the COVID-19, and our growth was halved to 3% in 2019-20, although we are now on a gradual recovery to 3.4% last year, and we project that this year we shall grow at about 3.8%. This is still well below the levels that we want to see of 7% or more. Now, is it only COVID? No, of course not. If you look at the period just before we performed well, their average performance was not as good. And there are a few other reasons, not simply the shocks I've talked about, but I would like to concentrate a little bit more there, because if we are to really deal with this, sustaining this growth, we have to deal with the shocks, first of all, but also we need to do the kind of policies and strategies and investments that will help. So the major reasons for this period, at least from my assessment, is the global financial crisis, which affected the external demand and therefore affected our exports, and we see it in the numbers. The second one is the weakening of the global FDI momentum that we saw in 2015 because of global crisis and all that. And then we also have climate change. During this period, we had more frequent droughts. We had the droughts in 2009-10, in 2011-12, as well as in 2016-17. So there were really 3 almost consecutive droughts that we saw there, and that affected our performance. However, there is also some other reason. That's declining productivity in different sectors. It's not only because of the shocks, but especially in agriculture, because the seeds were not good quality. And as I said, when we try to deal with that, we can see a boom in the subsequent years. Lastly, and this is the one I think we are going to examine in this forum, this is poor implementation of some policy and structural reforms. As I highlighted in the period, I think one of the strengths was the effective implementation of our reforms, particularly the policy and structural reforms that we are undertaking at that time. But I think we need to examine that in this regard, particularly, for example, in public investments. There is a lot of improvement that should be done, and a few other areas that will be touched on later today by the PSST himself, who will be leading that discussion in one of the afternoon sessions. Now, what are the goals of this forum? Just to set the scene, we are going to be having insights, ideas, and policies and strategies to accelerate and sustain the growth momentum we are already seeing. That's why our theme today is economic resilience. How do we deal with these problems of these shocks that are more frequent now, then recovery, and then resurgent growth? So the focus areas are going to be: 1, building resilience to future shocks, internal and external. And this will include strengthening policy space to deal with the shocks, diversification of our export basket and markets, just to make sure that if one market is not there, we can at least go elsewhere. Then dealing with climate change, because it is here with us, and as Jonathan Rippey highlighted, it's going to affect us significantly, not only domestically here, but even with our exports, because of the different restrictions that may come along. But also, domestically, we need to invest, for example, in climate-resilient public infrastructure. Yeah? The roads and bridges. A simple storm should actually not wash away the road, and then people can trade for some weeks because there was a big storm. We need to have an infrastructure that can withstand this kind of storms, and that has to be in terms of how we actually implement or invest in terms of our infrastructure. What do we do? It may be a little bit more costly, but we may have to do that. Then more resilient agriculture, urban transport system, and then we have to diversify our energy so that we do not contribute to the problem of climate change. So the second, and that's already highlighted, we want to look at trade. How do we drive recovery and accelerated growth using trade? So here we are going to be addressing the challenges and opportunities for Uganda. I want to elaborate there because there is a full session that we are going to have on that one. Then how do we make Uganda's growth more inclusive? How do we help households transition from subsistence to market economy? This is something that we have been singing, from informal self-employment to formal salaried work. This is going to be a whole session where we are going to discuss that, and I think one of the things we shall be discussing there is the parish model. How is it going to help us in this regard? How are we going to implement it to ensure that actually we manage to transition these households to the market economy? Then Uganda's growth strategy in the context of the global green growth agenda, implications for key sectors like oil and gas, as you know, the fossil oils, and then the agenda, how do we manage that, all right? and then the potential for other energy options. Then fifth, we want to look at how do we improve the effectiveness of government as a policymaker and an implementer so as to achieve high growth. Hence, we are going to have a session just focusing on policy implementations, challenges, and remedies. So to conclude, I'd like to say that Uganda managed to grow at more than 7% on average for the preceding 2 decades, before this one that I just highlighted the issues. Now, following a number of government interventions, GDP growth had recovered to over 6% in 2017, 18, and 18-19, and we were well on course to achieve middle income status. However, GDP growth slowed down to 4.5% on average in the last decade, partly because of the onset of the COVID pandemic and the shocks that I've highlighted, but also because of implementation, policy implementation. We need to discuss that. So Uganda needs to grow at 7% or more for several decades if we are to achieve upper middle income status as we want in the Vision 2040. So discussions in this forum will contribute to putting us back on the high growth path. We look forward to your ideas as we discuss the whole of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert Musisi, for setting in motion what will be the template for today's discussion. We are running rather a bit late, and so for the virtual audience that's joining us and also the audience at home, we'll try and catch up with the time we lost in the beginning, but not to dig into Dr. Albert's presentation. I'll quickly invite our next chair, the chair of the next session. Session 1, as Dr. Albert said, on enhancing resilience to the shocks that he described, and I won't go into the details because that's what Ramadan Gobi will be doing. So I want to invite our Permanent Secretary and Secretary of the Treasury to come and invite his speakers for this session. It will have a Q&A session or a plenary session within this session 1. And I will be helping the PSST at the back for the questions, but we'll manage this within the hour. And since we've run out of time, allow me quickly invite the PS, please, yes, feel free, to chair this session. You're welcome, PS.
Thank you very much, Maurice. I once again welcome all of you, the protocols, Honorable Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, seen honorable members of Parliament, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, my colleagues, the Permanent Secretaries, as well as heads of departments and agencies, development partners present, heads of private sector institutions, members of academia, members of civil society, the media fraternity, and all of you distinguished ladies and gentlemen here in the room and those who are joining us through the virtual means. I am glad as PSST to chair a session which is going to be talking about enhancement of resilience of the economy of Uganda against global as well as internal shocks, so that we can sustain what we have achieved in terms of growth, and make it even more inclusive. And therefore, I will be glad to receive a number of well-researched ideas on what we can do as those who are pretending over the economy to achieve this fundamental goal of sustaining the little we have, of building this resilience. We are going to discuss in this session instruments that Uganda can use, first of all, to protect our economy against COVID-19 and other shocks, particularly those other shocks which are likely to affect our main employer of Ugandans, agricultural sector. How do we mitigate those shocks? We will have 2 presentations in this session, and also we shall have 2 discussants. The first presentation is going to be on policy instruments that Uganda may employ to protect ourselves against global shocks. We shall begin from the global perspective. How do we protect ourselves? And I'm very glad to receive my good friend Dr. Michael Atingego, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, who will help us to understand what we are. And we are in it together, the 2 of us, as you know. So, Dr. Atingego, you are welcome. Dr. Atingego, as we all know, will come and have a seat here. Is the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Uganda. Previously, he served as Executive Director of the Macroeconomics and Financial Management at the Institute of Eastern and Southern Africa, based in Harare, Zimbabwe. And also, you remember, before that, he had been at the IMF and so many other places. If we are to mention them, we shall have no time to discuss things. He also holds a PhD in economics from Liverpool University, and also a master's in economics and banking from Cardiff, and a BS economics from Makerere University. So you are welcome, Dr. Atingego. We are also going to have a presentation after Dr. Atingego from Professor Tessa Bold, who will be talking about the things that we can do as Uganda to prepare for future shocks. Because, as you know, they say that shocks are like buses or taxis. Always another one is coming. As you think that you have managed to get out of one, another comes. So Bold is going to help us to talk about the shocks that we are likely to face in agriculture and how we can prepare and mitigate them. And I will invite her at the opportune time. But for now, Dr. Michael Atingego, you have 20 minutes. Kindly do justice on them. Thank you. Yeah. But this place does.
Thank you so much, PSST. Honorable Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the MPC are present, the permanent secretaries and heads of ministries, departments, and agencies, development partners, heads of the private sector institutions, members of academia, civil society, members of the media fraternity, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocol is observed. I must say I'm very privileged to come and share with you what I call a few thoughts on what we can do in terms of policy instruments to protect our country against global shock. These are just the thoughts that I have, but also built out of the experience I've had in life, working in different institutions, and then in my current job right now. So I'll just begin by saying that when we talk about global shocks, the global shocks can originate from so many sources, all right? It could be from the financial world, it could be cyberspace, it could be biological, solar. All these shocks can originate from different parts of the world. But because of the growing interconnectedness of the global economy, through financial, trade linkages, and more so, fast movement of people, all right? This has created conditions for rapid and widespread disruptions of shocks from the various parts of the world. So what is a shock in what part of the world will soon become global. Look at what happened to the Omicron variant of the COVID-19 in South Africa. The moment they announced it, I think in about 1 month's time, it was a global thing, right? So the capacity to transmit the shocks has kind of like really enhanced itself. Now, the question that faces us is, as low-income countries, we have many challenges. We are not well diversified. We have pre-existing structural inefficiencies. We don't have fiscal space. So we find that any adverse shock that hits us, however temporary it is, can have significant and profound impact on the economy. So what is our first line of defense? So that's why I'm therefore saying that there is need for effective policies and instruments to manage the shocks. Rather than to deal with the impact of the shock, how can we mitigate? How can we put in place a framework that mitigates the advanced consequences of the shocks that are likely to hit us? So here I would like to propose two types of policies and instruments. There's what I would call ex-ante policies and instruments, and then what I would call the ex-post policies and instruments. Now, what I call the ex-ante instruments are meant to help mitigate the impact of the shocks. So this is what I would call self-insurance, to limit the probability of shocks happening, and if they do happen, how do we minimize the impact of the damage to the economy? Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. So, ex-ante instruments, how do we help mitigate, self-insure, limit the probability, and the impact of the shocks in the economy? And then we can also look at what I call the ex-post instruments, on the other hand, are instruments that are meant to help minimize the scale of the damage from the shocks with a view to reinvigorating the economy after the shocks. So let me look at the case for ex-ante policies and instruments. Now, the ex-ante financial instruments or pre-arranged financial safety nets can ensure the economies against shocks. What these do, they kind of like enhance the predictability of public finances to the extent that one can determine what kind of financial assistance is needed when a shock comes. It also helps to reduce the pro-cyclicality of the shock, because when a shock is pro-cyclical, then you can in advance work out what we call the counter-cyclical policies to deal with the impact of the shock. So you need to put these things in place before the shock hits you. And then there's a need to guarantee prompt liquidity needs as instruments are disbursed quickly after the shocks that hit the economy. So before the shock comes in, do you have in place some social safety nets? Do you have effective transfer mechanisms? Or you wait until a shock comes, then you try to identify who are the vulnerable, what is the criteria, and what have you. So I think we need to be very prepared with the kind of databases that are helpful in terms of addressing the impact of the shocks. And then the most important thing is that it also helps you to a large extent preserve your sustainability. Because if you are not prepared, you find yourself going on a borrowing spree to deal with a shock, and because those actions you take under those difficult times sometimes are not well thought out. But what is the experience that we're seeing to date? The experience that we're seeing to date is that there's a low use of ex-ante instruments among low-income countries, largely due to weak technical capacity in these countries, and then also their cost considerations, and then the difficulty in assessing and verifying the contingency needs. So I think we need to really work on these areas if we have to enhance our ex-ante policy instruments. So there are a number of, so here I am giving examples of ex-ante policies and instruments. We talk about export diversification, we talk about buffers, fiscal rules to manage revenue windfalls. But to me, the most important, really, of all this are governance and institutional mechanisms for transparency and accountability in the use of government resources, policy formulation, and impact assessment. In the absence of government accountability, ensuring value for money, no matter what amount of resources you put in to deal with a shock, the beneficiaries of these resources are likely to lose out. So how do we put in place governance frameworks that ensure effective delivery of the resources to the vulnerable, to the areas that are meant to be addressed? And then, of course, I talked about prearranged financial safety nets. Then importantly to me is digitalization. We will see later on that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries that were very prepared in terms of digitalization managed to a large extent mitigate the adverse consequences of the COVID-19. So digitalization becomes very important, first of all in contact tracing, isolation, remote working, learning, sending financial assistance through cash transfers, and what have you. So these are just a few of the ex-ante instruments that I'm talking about. However, also there are limitations, like I said earlier on the use of these instruments, that low-income countries face immense development needs, which imply huge opportunity costs of savings and building buffers. I'll come back to the issue of buffers. And also, if you talk about reserves, the opportunity cost of building up reserves is quite high. They are quite a fiscal cost. If you look at, for example, I'm buying foreign currency today to build central bank reserves. I have to move up that liquidity that I'm injecting. I'm mopping up at 6.5% using the CBR rate. But my interest rate on these reserves is under 1%. That's the quasi-fiscal cost, which is booked in the losses of the central bank. So these are some of the, the downsides to that. But let me also bring other considerations. And these considerations were touched on by Albert. Implementing structural reforms, we talk about structural reforms, it's not for the sake of structural reforms. Implementation of structural reforms to change the fabric of the economy, particularly institutional and regulatory reforms, is very necessary to enable the business re-engineering in the face of shocks and realize growth even in the face of shocks. So this structural reform that we're talking about is not to hurt people. I know sometimes they step on some vested interests, but it's to prepare our private sector to give them the capability to business re-engineer, all right, when they are faced with shocks, so that they're able to adjust to, to what's happening. And we need to look at our institutions. Is our regulatory framework well designed to support business engineering by the private sector? And then let me go on emerging challenges. Emerging challenges have been touched. For example, climate change. Climate change, I don't need to overemphasize this, is a very serious issue. let me tackle it from the financial sector angle. You see, right now, if a drought that hits the economy, all right, and reduces growth by 2-3 percentage points takes place, I need to find out what is the impact of this on the financial institution's balance sheet. What are the risks? Am I doing a stress testing on the balance sheets of commercial banks to understand the impact of this? And what does it mean for the capitational level? So now, as Bank of Uganda, what we are trying to do, our contribution towards this is we are trying to develop a framework that integrates climate risks into the operations of the central bank and also the financial sector, with a view to strengthening resilience of climate change on the balance sheets of the financial institutions, and identifying policies that can be used to promote green financing so that we see from the financial sector how we can make our little contribution towards that. And then there's the impact of the disruptive technologies. You are all aware of the fourth industrial revolution. That is creating jobs, destroying jobs. Now, for those ones that are being destroyed out of the jobs, how are we dealing with them? Are we preparing them for that destruction? Because if the jobs are destroyed and these guys have no fallback position, that is a very serious issue that we need to deal with. And then the explosion of infodemics. The amount of information that is out there, both misinformation, disinformation, accurate information about a shock, may limit the capacity of a government to even address the impact of a shock. Take, for example, the COVID-19 vaccinations, I mean, there are all kinds of things that are flying out there. So unless you have a clear communication strategy to deal with this kind of thing, it becomes difficult. And it could exacerbate the impact of a shock. So how do we prepare as a country to deal with all the shocks? And then I think we need to enhance our surveillance. Things like risk and vulnerability assessments. As a country, as Uganda, do we know what risks are facing us today? Do we know what vulnerabilities that we're exposed to? Can we identify them? And can we assess the likelihood of occurrence and the impact should they occur? And can we put in place policy recommendations to limit the adverse impact of the shocks even before they occur? So to me, these are the key challenges that we need to undertake in ex-ante design of policies and instruments. And then the most important thing is inclusive growth to address societal inequality and poverty can exacerbate the impact of a shock. Let me just give you a story. I read a commentary. You all recall that when the former president of South Africa was arrested, something to do with some charges, there were these widespread looting and things that happened in South Africa. We saw it in Swaziland. One commentary was impact of the lockdown on the majority of the people that had put them out of employment, that had created inequalities and frustrations, needed a trigger for the population to express their discontent with the government. So when you have a society that's vulnerable because of inequality, because of poverty, you need a small trigger. You don't need to mobilize this population. Just a small trigger. And these guys can go on rampage and will destroy even little that you have. So one way to deal with the impact of shocks is how do you empower society through inclusive growth? And that's why the topic on inclusive growth is going to be very important, because it's an opportunity cost to this kind of thing here. And then finally, the issue of buffers. You all remember that during the global financial crisis, a number of low-income countries were able to weather the impact of the global financial crisis because they had sufficient buffers. Their debt GDP ratios were low, their fiscal deficits were low, inflation was low. But ever since the unwinding of the global financial crisis, we have never gone back to rebuild those buffers. So right now, when we're hit with the shock, our degrees of freedom are very much limited. We have high debt levels, we have high fiscal deficits. So how do we respond to this kind of shock? So in as much as it's expensive, we need to seriously reconsider the issues of rebuilding buffers. Now, ex post policies and instruments, I think examples here are how do we deal with sharp swings in terms of trade? We are now going into oil production shortly, and we all know the business cycles of the oil. So how do we deal with such sharp swings in terms of trade? Because they have considerable impact on macroeconomic and output volatility, and it increases the risks and uncertainty for the private sector and government. There are abrupt revenue losses, which can also affect the spending, and it can complicate the country's sustainability going forward. So examples of policies and instruments, I mentioned a few of them here. This includes macroeconomic adjustments, financing, structural reforms and policies, again, governance and institutional mechanism. I really want to emphasize the word governance and institutional mechanism. No matter what we do, in the absence of effective governance and institutional mechanisms, and we don't realize value for money, we don't implement the right projects, we will not get the full benefits of the policies and the instruments that we are looking for. And then I mentioned some fiscal policy things there, like reduction of spending on non-trade areas, postpone capital intensive, and then revenue enhancing measurements. Then I mentioned something about monetary policy and exchange adjustments to allow for the flexibility to adjust to that. And then concessional financing also becomes important. But now let me again link this to climate change. Now, if you are going to issue a bond in the international markets, the ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, are now also becoming a factor that you have in place some green financing policies. If you don't have, you pay premium. So I think we need really to ensure that these climate financing, these addressing climate shocks is very important if we have to get good concessional financing from the, to get good market financing going forward. Again, I'm not going to emphasize the impact of structural reforms because of what we have already discovered or discussed. Again, governance and institutional mechanisms, I don't need to overemphasize that. But let me just give you an example that why we need here institutional mechanisms. I talked about enhancing systems for distribution of financial and food assistance. You remember when the Honorable Prime Minister was trying to identify who are the vulnerable. It was a problem coming out, who was the vulnerable, because vulnerability is the moving target, right? So today, it is the guys who are in the night economy. Tomorrow, it is the guys who are being affected by floods in Mount Elgon. Tomorrow, it is the guys whose cattle have been rustled. So the definition of vulnerability needs us to be very prepared with databases so that the moment the shock comes in, we're able to identify who's vulnerable. So in conclusion, Chair, the evidence shows that recovery in the global economic growth following the adverse impact of COVID-19 has in part been driven by countries with strong ex-ante instruments, such as well-diversified economies, governance structures, contract tracing mechanisms that have been able to be sustained by digitalization, as well as strong export instruments. So what am I saying? There's therefore need to develop governance and operational support systems for the vulnerable people, including establishing robust databases and dual capacity of the responsible MDAs to undertake financial safety nets with international financial institutions. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that expose of a number of things that we need to do in the policy space to mitigate or to avoid those global shocks. In a quick summary, what Mike is actually telling us, the aspect of governance, accountability, value for money. I usually summarize this as accountability with the results, not accountability on paper. And is saying this can only be achieved if we institutionalize the way we do business in government in a way which is traceable, digitized, and as government of Uganda, we are now very much prioritizing this area. The digitization in the Ministry of Finance, all transactions now are done online. We have the IFMIS for managing the finances. We even budget electronically. You don't run around with the papers of work plans and so on. We do them online. We have brought on board electronic human resource management. All aspects of human resource, from recruitment to deployment to even those who are seeking leave and so on, electronically done. If you are talking of procurement, we are bringing the e-procurement. All of these, in other words, are some of the efforts to ensure that we can build that institutional capacity. So, Michael, thank you very much. We shall interact later. Now, I would want to bring in the second presenter. She's going to talk to us about preparing for future shocks. And she's using the case of our agricultural sector. Professor Tessa Bold from Stockholm University is the presenter, is an associate professor at the Institute of International Economic Studies of Stockholm University. She was previously a professor of development economics at the University of Frankfurt. And she had her graduate education at Oxford University in the UK in economics. Professor, you are welcome. You have 20 minutes. Kindly tell us what we need to do in order to avoid the future shocks in agriculture.
Been in person at previous rounds of this event, and it's very nice to see it happening again, and it would have been great to be there in person, but now remotely. So yes, so I will talk about preparing for future shocks, and of course there are many, but the shock that has been mentioned repeatedly, and I do think is on everyone's mind, aside from, of course, the COVID pandemic, is climate change. And so I'm going to talk about the case of Ugandan agriculture and climate change. So there are a lot of predictions and scenarios being made for how climate change is going to affect agriculture. Kind of, these are global predictions, so they're also applied to sub-Saharan Africa, and it's expected to have large negative effects on productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. So here is one projection from 2007 going forward to 2080, how climate change is going to affect agricultural productivity. This is done for the entire world, and of course the message that we always hear all the time is that climate change is not going to be a shock that affects everyone equally, but it's going to have very heterogeneous impacts here. So the areas that are sort of yellower and greenish will actually see improvements in agricultural productivity as the climates become warmer, and then the areas that are sort of dark red are the ones that are worst affected. And so here we have East Africa, and here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, we have Uganda. So for all of sub-Saharan Africa, agricultural productivity is expected to be negatively affected. But even within the continent, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So if I can translate the colors here properly, then I think on this measure here, Uganda agricultural productivity is supposed to be in the -10 to -20% productivity change. What we know also, or what we expect also to happen, is that because of these productivity changes, that actually food prices are going to increase a lot. So here, almost the whole globe will expect positive increases. There are a few places that will expect falls, and again, you see the most concentration here within sub-Saharan Africa. So this is, of course, a kind of important shock that will most likely happen unless we change, abatement very significantly from what we're doing right now. And so what I want to do in this talk is actually talk you through kind of a few scenarios of what's being predicted for sub-Saharan Africa and also Uganda more specifically. But it's also going to be important to really highlight that there's a lot of, within these scenarios and these predictions, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what's predicted for sub-Saharan Africa as a continent, and even across scenarios, what is the predicted outcome for Uganda. So here, just to give you another summary here, this is from another projection. What is the predicted change in crops here, crop yields? So for sub-Saharan Africa, so for example, maize yields are projected to drop by a little, rice and wheat a lot, other crops minus 43.9%. So overall, that makes for a drop in 40% in crop yields. So these agricultural yield losses are predicted to translate into large welfare losses in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's sort of three forces at work to create a perfect storm. So first of all, food is a large share in consumer expenditure, and it's clear that it's the agricultural sector that's particularly vulnerable to climate change. It's certainly proportionately much more vulnerable to climate change than the non-agricultural sector. And since food is a large share in consumer expenditure, so that makes sub-Saharan Africa very vulnerable. Sub-Saharan Africa is also a net importer of food, the continent as a whole, not each particular country. It's also largely specialized in subsistence crops that are not traded, and so that makes it difficult to, for example, as food prices rise, to then benefit from terms of trade improvements. So if crops that you export become more expensive, then that's, of course, gives you a positive boost in terms of the terms of trade. So how can climate change damages be mitigated? So I'm here really thinking about mitigation, not really abatement of CO2 emissions. Well, and the lesson really is that comes out of all the scenarios is adjusting crop production patterns. So climate change will have very heterogeneous impacts on crop yields, even even across like a basket of crops. So really, policy needs to be very responsive to that, or agriculture needs to be very responsive to that, by adjusting trade patterns, and really very important by modernizing agriculture and adopting modern technology. So in some sense, I'm sort of foreshadowing this, but the recommendations are not so different to what needs to happen anyway in order to modernize agriculture, in order to grow, etc. So I want to give you kind of an overview of three simulations here. So why have I chosen those three? So I think those three simulations are kind of the best of what economics right now has to offer in terms of thinking about the effects of climate change. So when we look at the IPCC scenarios, then they tell us, okay, if CO2 emissions continue in this way, we're going to have this much warming. and that's going to create this much damage. And of course, the projections are very dire. What economists have to sort of offer in terms of a contribution there is to think about, well, but as the climate changes, things are not going to stay as they are. Crops are not going to be produced in countries where yields are very damaged by climate change. Production might move to more northern climates, etc. So to really think about all these economic interactions between the climate and the economy and vice versa, and say therefore to give kind of predictions and scenarios that that tell us what happens. Yes, there may be climate change, but then economies can also adapt optimally or less optimally to this climate change. So here's sort of three very recent or quite recent efforts to estimate the effects of climate change, all focused on the agricultural sector, all having either a global outlook or looking at all of sub-Saharan Africa. Uganda is part of some of these samples, is in 2 of these studies, not in the 3rd, but it's always, as part of a bigger modeling effort. And so that means some kind of abstractions are necessary. So the first study I want to talk about is Costinot et al. That's a really well-known study within economics, and that really looks at the 10 most important crops, but globally speaking. And so they think about, given what we know, how potential yields are expected to change with climate change, how much can this be mitigated, these damages, if within each country farmers adjust optimally, how much they grow of the crops they're already growing, or if they also start adopting new crops that now suddenly become possible to grow, but that weren't possible to grow before. Should I continue? So for you, I hear a lot of background noise, but I guess I should continue. So for Uganda, their model predicts a drop in welfare as percentage of GDP of 3.95%. So 4% if both trade and crop choice adjust optimally to climate change shock. So both in terms of, you start exporting crops where you have a comparative advantage, and also, farmers really adjust optimally to which crops now become more productive. If these adjustments do not happen, so essentially everyone just continues what they're doing, then the effect of climate change is predicted to translate into a loss of minus 7.61%. So of course, these are not small losses. On the other hand, as I said, this heterogeneity is really important. So within their model, the headline results that all the economists like to cite is that Malawi, for example, is predicted to have a loss of 50%. So you see, I mean, there's this huge heterogeneity across the continent. Then in the second simulation, so these authors have a slightly different focus. They're looking at different crops. They're looking at different adjustment margins. They don't have a specific estimate for Uganda. Their general prediction for climate change and the effects on sub-Saharan Africa is that it will have large negative effects. The welfare is predicted to fall between 6.55 to 10%, depending on how well crop choice and trade adaptation is allowed to work. So in all these models, being able to trade more as some places become really bad at producing a certain crop and others become better. Of course, trade is going to be an important mechanism to mitigate these shocks. So I'm going to skip this one. But there are also outliers in sub-Saharan Africa. So for example, in their simulation, Kenya and Ethiopia are actually predicted to benefit from climate change in this model, but then again, not in others. And here it's really because of improved terms of trade, and you all perhaps have a sense what Ethiopia and Kenya look like and how that differs from Uganda. They are more active on the export market. They are exporting coffee, flowers, etc. on the international markets to a higher degree than what Uganda does. And so they are actually going to benefit from climate change to the extent that these products become more expensive. and so their terms of trade are going to improve. They will still see a small drop in agricultural productivity, but overall, because of this higher participation in trade, here in this model, they're actually expected to benefit. So let me come to a third simulation. So this third simulation is of most interest because it really perhaps hones in most on the Ugandan case. So first of all, it's only looking at sub-Saharan Africa, and second of all, it's only looking at subsistence crops. So it's really looking at the crops that are to some extent most relevant for the status quo. Again here, so this is a very interesting picture because it really shows well the heterogeneity in how climate change is expected to affect various crops and various countries. So here on the left-hand side, you have current potential yields, I should say. So you see here, in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, so to speak, so in sub-Saharan Africa, you see actually a lot of very dark blue. Then as you go to the top and to the bottom, you get lower, north and south, you get lower yields. But actually a lot of areas here in the darkish blue with relatively high yields. And then you see how climate change is expected to change that. But you also see the large heterogeneity here. So here actually, for Uganda in this particular model, and for this basket of crops, which is very relevant, there is not expected to be a big change, a big drop in yields. That's my reading of this figure. Of course, here then you see other countries where the changes are huge. So you go from something like 9 tons per hectare to 0 for some of these crops, close to 0. So the same thing here is then the change in average suitability to agriculture. Here again, this is now this is over time. So between 2022, between now, actually 2000 and 2080, which is what all these scenarios are for. So going about 60 years into the future. And you see here again that in Uganda and Eastern Africa, actually, we expect some positive changes for these subsistence crops, this basket of subsistence crops. So this is the average change. This is how much it's going to vary. So in both cases, actually, so here you see the places that are really expected to see these big drops, really the center of Africa. But here in Eastern Africa, we actually expect increases. So to some extent, in this scenario, actually, Uganda looks like, despite this huge heterogeneity, not so badly affected. And of course, that's taking Ugandan subsistence crops. Whatever happens in all Ugandan's neighbors and in the rest of the world, of course, is going to affect Uganda. So each scenario homes in on a different issue. What this scenario really emphasizes is the importance of adoption of modern inputs. So this across the continent, again, huge heterogeneity, can really make a big difference. So in the benchmark results in this scenario, they expect a drop in real GDP change. So if, business as usual, climate change happens, as predicted by the IPCC, they expect a drop in real GDP of about minus 4.24%. But if, under a scenario of intermediate technology adoption, and this is modern technology adoption in agriculture, so modern seeds is the main thing they're thinking about here, or high technology adoption, you can actually reverse this and turn it into positive. So what would the real GDP change be here? So what are the general lessons from the modeling exercise? So really my reading of these scenarios for Uganda is that anything that will allow agricultural markets to function better will help with climate change adaptation. So putting policies in place that will allow farmers to respond to comparative advantage and really, help them, also give them information about which crops are going to become more productive, which crops are going to become less productive, helping them making these optimal crop portfolio choices is going to be really important. Putting policies in place that allows farmers to adopt new crops and change crop patterns quickly and to adopt modern technologies. Increasing exports to international markets is also important for the terms of trade channel. to operate. So is that likely to happen? I mean, is Ugandan agriculture in a situation where it is highly adaptable? My sense is that that we have examples where that hasn't been the case. So I just picked out one example here. So for example, the army worms, there was a huge infestation in 2017 and destroyed 1% of the national GDP worth of maize. And these crop losses affected a lot of people directly. So the official recommendation at the time was to combat army worm, every 3 days, you're supposed to scout the field because these eggs hatch every 2 to 3 days. You're supposed to spray insecticide into the maize wall because that's the place where these caterpillars hide. But in practice, actually, based on qualitative evidence that one of our PhD students collected, there was evidence that farmers were really adopting practices that had not been recommended by the government, spraying plants with laundry detergent. Farmers very rarely reported that they actually had contact with government extension officers. This is in the area where we did the research. I can't speak about all of Uganda in this case. And that the contact was actually not related to combating armyworm infestation. So this is just one example of a very, recent shock to agriculture and kind of, and some anecdotal evidence how well and how quickly farmers were able to adapt and to combat this. I see a raised hand, but I'm not sure if I can take questions during the talk. I guess I'll continue for now, and then perhaps we can take it in the chat. So what is the scope for sort of market-driven modernization of agriculture? So this is an area where I myself, with colleagues from Stockholm and from Kampala, have been very active in trying to understand how can we get farmers to modernize their production, to upgrade the quality of what they import. I mean, the focus of what they produce. I mean, the focus is very much on increasing yields and so on, but there are actually other margins along which farmers can improve their income. And that is actually by improving the quality of what they produce. So in a very recent study, we studied the effects on smallholder farmers of linking them to a buyer of high quality maize for urban consumers, but also potentially export markets. So in the study, we also first start off by showing that maize quality that farmers produce, smallholder farmers produce, is very low, that when they increase the quality of maize that they produce in the local markets in which they operate, there's no return to that. The local traders do not reward it, but that farmers are actually willing to invest, because it's costly, to invest in producing higher maize quality. So a lot of that is post-harvest processing, when there is a price incentive to do so. And so we did that by experimentally linking them to a buyer of high quality. So important in terms of thinking about climate change here as well. This kind of market access, it induced farms to produce higher quality maize. It had large effects on income, increases between 30 to 80%. It increased agricultural productivity by about 15%, so farmers were becoming more productive. They did not increase the acreage that they were devoting to maize. So these were all on the plots that they were already farming, and that's of course something important to think about in terms of modernizing agriculture, because there's always also this trade-off with deforestation, etc. But we see here that they improved their productivity on the given land that they had. But we also found that despite these increases in income, despite the farmers being provided with extension services, encouraging them to use modern inputs such as hybrid seeds and fertilizer, that was really a margin along which it was very difficult to get farmers to change their behavior. And that is unfortunately a lesson that comes out of many, many research programs that we see. It's really hard to make progress on that margin. So let me conclude. So climate change is predicted to have large negative effects on sub-Saharan Africa in general. That, I think, goes through all the scenarios. Increases in agricultural yields are to be expected, and increases in food prices. The case for Uganda is less clear, or at least it depends on the particular simulation scenarios that authors have in mind. But what also comes out of these scenarios is that either way, that modernizing agriculture and allowing market-mediated mechanisms, such as trade, to operate are actually important mechanisms both for growth and for protection against climate change. So again, crop choices need to respond to changes in productivity. Agriculture needs to be able to adapt flexibly and adopt modern inputs. There needs to be meaningful participation in international trade. And sort of as a byproduct, this again depends on the scenario, but of course it's good for growth. It's that non-agricultural productivity must increase. That will be helpful as comparative advantage changes. So let me conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, so much for that presentation. I think you'll agree with me that the issue of climate change is coming out as the main emerging lesson we need to learn, because we are likely to see increased food prices if we don't adapt to the modern technologies, and also ensure that we reduce the vulnerability. I'm also shocked that we are still in data net food importers. We usually want to call ourselves the food basket. I don't know which basket is this one, where we are net food importers, meaning we export some food, but the money we spend on importing food is much more. And it is something which we need some reflection on. And also the issue of agricultural productivity. How do we get the farm yields to rise? The good news, which I've heard from the professor, is that we are not likely to be as badly affected, according to some of the simulations, but only if we are able to get our farmers adopt modern technologies that would enhance adaptability, and also only if we become more competitive by increasing export of our agricultural produce or products, and also increase the investment in effective deployment of farm extension workers. In Uganda, I wanted to inform the professor that we are approaching these days agriculture using value chain, as a value chain approach. So we are not only looking at how to enhance production and productivity alone. That's just one segment. I would have loved to hear the entire agricultural value chain analyzed in how we can get it better, storage and primary processing, value addition, as well as marketing, because we want to make agriculture increasingly demand-driven so that we avoid some of the mistakes we've had in the past. We are slightly changing the program. As you can see, there is another presenter who is showing on the screens and is far. So I'm going to hand over to Maurice, and then the discussion of this session is going to come after this presentation has been done. And I think I will request someone, Maurice will get someone to help me chair the discussion, and I will come back later in the afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentation of Dr. Michael Tingego, a hand clap for him, and the presentation from Professor Tessa Bold. And Mike and I will be coming back a little bit later, and then we have that discussion. Thank you very much.
A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the PSST and the Deputy Governor. You could now take your seats. And I also want to thank Tessa, Professor Tessa, for her presentation. Please park those questions. We'll come to those questions after after the lunch session, where we will open up the sessions to feedback. But also, Professor Tessa said she's available with the team that is online, and she can take some of your questions. But let me quickly move to our next session on climate change and sustainable growth in Uganda. Professor Tessa did speak to part of the impact of climate change on our agricultural sector. So allow me to invite Nicholas Sun, or Lord Nicholas Sun. Your profile is so huge that we'll probably spend 30 minutes running through it. So allow me not to run through that, Professor. He will be in discussion with Shanta Devarayan. And allow me to invite you, Prof, to kick off this conversation. You will be looking at the role of adaptation and mitigation to climate change from the perspective of development as a whole. And the conversation will discuss Africa, wide issues with passing implications for Uganda. Over to you, Nicholas.
Shanta, do you want to kick off? Because as I understand it, you will be asking me questions. We will be having a conversation, but we should underline that Shanta and I worked together over the years as academics and in the World Bank, and in particular, Shanta was a very distinguished chief economist for Africa. So he's been much more deeply and much more recently into many of these issues than I have. But I did want to remark that I first came to Uganda in 1967, soon after I'd graduated, and I was reflecting at that time that the population of Uganda was under 10 million. Now, of course, it's over 40. And so much has changed in that time. I worked a little bit with President Museveni when Jim Adams was Vice President for Africa at the World Bank, and I was chief economist. That would be around 2001, 2002 when I came. But I have not been to Uganda as often as I would have wished, but it does stretch back over more than half a century. I've watched very fondly from outside. So that's just a slightly personal introduction, but Shanta, as I understand it, we're going to talk to each other and you're going to ask some questions and we'll have a conversation.
Okay, thanks very much. And let me also add on a personal note, it's a pleasure to be here with my old friend Nick Stern, but also several other people around the room, in particular Michael, the Deputy Governor, and to listen to the last few minutes of Tessa Bowles' very nice keynote, which actually echoes some of the themes that we are about to embark on. So let me jump right in and ask you, Nick, first to structure the conversation. Would you agree that the big problem with respect to climate change in Uganda is adaptation to the effects of climate change as distinct from the mitigation of carbon emissions? That in the relative magnitudes of those two, the big challenge, and I think this is echoed a little bit in Tessa's presentation as well, is about adaptation. So let me just lay that out as the first proposition.
I would say yes, Shanta, but it's a qualified yes. And what we have to do is to recognize that so much of what we have to do, whichever country we're in, including Uganda, is to put development, adaptation, and reduction of emissions, which we call mitigation in shorthand, together. And that is now the challenge of development and growth in all countries of the world. And there are some countries, Uganda clearly an example, which emit much less than others. But it's the sum total of emissions in the world that matters, and it's the sum total of emissions over time that matters. And we all hope very much that Uganda's development will move strongly over the next 50 years. Certainly Africa as a whole, as its population doubles in the next 30 or 40 years, will have a very big weight in the emissions of the world, potentially. Of course, what we're all planning to do is to reduce emissions dramatically, indeed go to net zero. In other words, to break the relationship between economic activity on the one hand and damage to the environment, and within that, emissions on the other. But it's clear from those kinds of numbers that unless we act to reduce and to take away that connection between economic activity and emissions, that at some stage that Africa will be very large in the emissions of the world. But it could be very small, and indeed net zero, if the development story puts development, adaptation and mitigation together. And that is, I think, key to recognizing where development paths around the world should go. But it's also key to recognizing the tremendous returns to doing development differently, that actually when we see it that way, of putting those things together, the opportunities are tremendous. But yes, the immediate problems are tackling adaptation, or tackling the tremendous risks of climate change and adapting. And there, of course, we have to think through what those risks are and how our actions to take on those risks, to reduce those risks, fit with development. Tessa described, I thought, very, very well and clearly how those things fit together. It would be crazy to ignore risks that threaten lives and livelihoods. How could that be good development? But also when you recognize what you have to do, particularly around natural capital, particularly about water, particularly about land degradation, the threats from storms and droughts. And there it seems to me we have to particularly focus our attention. A narrow view of agricultural productivity does not really pick up the great threats of climate change. You know, 30 or 40 years from now, the share of agriculture in Uganda's GDP will probably be ballpark 10%. Now, the people in agriculture will generally be poorer than elsewhere, but if you're looking at the whole threat of climate change, reduced agricultural productivity is just a bit of it. It's an important bit, but quantitatively, just a bit of it. The threats from what we're seeing in terms of storms, and you get much more intensive rainfall in short periods of time that can be absolutely devastating. And we're going to get more of those. In some areas that you can get droughts, which can be devastating also. There will be some parts of Uganda and northern and eastern Africa in general, where the intensity of heat in 30, 40, 50 years time could be such that you cannot be outside for more than a few hours without dying. So if you think of what the threats are, they are in terms of really, in large measure, storms and floods and droughts. In some cases, you're going to get the extreme heat, and we're going to see immense dangers of conflict. We're already seeing in many parts of Africa how pastoralists and agriculturalists can come into conflict as a result of climate change. We've seen it in Sudan, we're seeing it in Nigeria, and those kinds of things will be more frequent. So those intense weather events, storms and floods and droughts, the extreme heat and the conflict, those are all things where I would put at the top of the list of worrying about climate change. And dealing with those and handling those is very much about development. It's about investing in infrastructure, and examples I gave, particularly in water management. We're seeing much more clearly that it's about investing in natural capital. A lot of what we need to do is to manage our land much better. You know, if you deforest, then when you get extreme storms and floods, you just take away the topsoil and it just disappears. The whole question of natural capital, how we manage our hills and our forests and how we restore degraded land, those are all going to loom very large as a result of climate change. So it will be good development, but some issues in that story are going to move right up the agenda, particularly around water management, particularly around natural capital, but also, of course, about diversification.
Great, exactly. And I think thanks for that great overview of the threats posed by climate change on a country like Uganda, but also the opportunities, which, as you said very clearly, are development opportunities as well. So my question is, are there things we should be doing on adaptation to climate change that are not consistent with good development? Or is it all about just accelerating development, accelerating agricultural productivity, as Tessa was emphasizing, having resilient infrastructure? Even if there were no climate change, these are things we should be doing anyway.
They are things we should be doing anyway, but the balance of emphasis I think does change across infrastructure. I think in many communities, water management is of special importance, and natural capital is of special importance. Natural capital means, restoring degraded land, managing your forests much better, and so on. Air pollution, of course, is a very big part of the story. So if you start thinking about the risks of climate change, you don't actually invent new things. It is about strong, clean, resilient infrastructure in the four big areas of infrastructure: energy, transport, water, and communications. It is about those things. But I think the emphasis does change. I think we move still more strongly towards public transport, which is a very big part of the story and the communications of dealing with crises as they occur. And that's an example where good development, adaptation, and reduced emissions come together.
Yeah, I want to get to emissions in a minute. Yeah, let's stay on adaptation for a minute.
Restoring degraded land, I think, I would emphasize still more strongly. So it's a question of A, emphasis, and B, the kind of infrastructure that you build.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That the priority list might shift, but it's the same priority list, and it's in many ways the same instruments that we need to use. But my question then is, if you look at Africa in general, and maybe Uganda in particular, these are good development activities that we should have been doing for a long time. We should be accelerating agricultural productivity a long time ago, and to a much higher level, as many of the successful East Asian countries have done. But we haven't achieved that yet in Africa. So my question, and there are many reasons for that, and some of them are political, some of them have to do with the circumstances. So the question is, why do we think we can do these things now, especially given their urgency? We almost have to. But what's going to change to get agricultural productivity to grow even higher than it's been in the past?
Well, there you have to be much closer to the ground than I have been in the last years. But let me give you an example of my very first applied project, which was tea in Kenya, smallholder tea in Kenya in 1969. And that was soon after independence, and some land had been reallocated. And there, on small plots of land, often about a third of an acre, smallholders were offered the opportunity to grow tea, mostly women farmers. And they did, in fact, invest very well and very quickly. And you all know now how big tea is in Kenya's economy, but I was there in the 60s as that was being built up. So how did it work? I mean, this is a partial reply to your question, Shanta. How did a success work? What were the factors of success? And can we recognize and build on those? Can we recognize what might have been undermining those in the past? So what you needed in order to do that was talented farmers, which you did have in very big measure, the women in Kenya. But you needed good agricultural extension because this was a new crop. You needed roads because you had to take the tea from the tea gardens, which were dispersed now, to the factory within a few hours. And of course, those were Murram roads, and when it rains, Murram roads don't work so well, so you had to manage that part of the story. So part of it was transport infrastructure. Part of it was good management of the payment system, so that there were ways of getting the money to the farmers in good time, so they could manage what they were doing. And you need good collaboration with the tea factories, which are mostly private sector. And of course, you can't make quality of tea in factory, but you can destroy it in the factory. And then you need good marketing on the world markets. So you can see that this was, as it were, a supply chain, which was mentioned earlier, all the way from the smallest plot right through to the big markets of the world. And it did work. And it worked because of good agricultural extension. It worked because of the necessary investment in the roads. And it worked very much because of good governance, reliability of the payment system, and good collaboration in terms of examining the quality of the tea. Because you can always, if you're picking tea, you take 2 leaves and a bud off the top of the tea bush. And of course, the 3rd leaf down is bigger than the 2 at the top. And you can always up your weight by going down and taking the 3rd leaf, but of course you reduce the quality of the tea. So that's an example. I know I'm getting a bit specific here, but that's an example of what good governance means and good collaboration means. And what was so impressive is all that happened. Yeah? And that then is a sort of partial answer to your question. It's about investment in infrastructure, investment in agricultural extension, investment in good governance, and trusting the payments systems. So the threats to all those are the threats that you need to overcome in order to increase agricultural productivity. But I'm giving you the example of the increase in agricultural productivity that was remarkable and that I was very close to. And then you can deconstruct that and see, well, what goes wrong? It's bad infrastructure, it's bad governance, it's corruption. And those were the things that could have undermined this. But in that context, they didn't. And I emphasize the example because one way or the other, it's more or less continued.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point, that's a great example in Kenya of the tea sector, which, by the way, has become a major competitor to Sri Lanka's tea sector, but I'm delighted by that. But we know that the problem isn't, or the solution hasn't been applied universally around Africa. And as you were quite rightly said, the constraints are the lack of good governance in many areas that is standing in the way of progress. I mean, you mentioned roads. One thing I learned when I was chief economist in Africa is that the big problem with roads is not simply the physical existence of the roads, but the trucking monopolies that dominate almost every country in Africa, where you have trucking prices that are about 50% higher than comparable prices anywhere else in the world. And that stands in the way of being competitive in world markets with your produce, including agricultural products. And it doesn't help that in many countries, the president's relatives are the owners of the trucking company. And so it's very difficult to get reform of deregulation of the trucking industry. Now, so my question is, if that's the situation, and we're in a kind of low-level equilibrium here, where the political forces are such that we don't get more investment in infrastructure, or we get more investment in infrastructure, but it's not productive. Then my question is, does the threat of climate change, or could the threat of climate change actually tip the balance in favor of better decisions on infrastructure and on agriculture? If you think we're stuck here, and then you say, look, but there's a meteor heading towards Uganda. If we don't do something about it, we're all sunk. In that case, maybe we can shift the political equilibrium in favor of better governance and better development.
I think it could happen, Shanta, and the task of everyone involved is to try to help it happen that way. But if you look back in history, if countries recognize the shared threat, now often that's an external threat associated with war. This is rare different, but we are in very different times. We're in times we haven't seen before in history. But if you together recognize a shared threat, then sometimes people do come together to respond to that threat. I hope particularly in this case, because the opportunities are so strong if we act in the right way. Restoring degraded land, planting trees up the hills to look after the land and its ability to absorb the water, planting trees around the rivers to control, as it were, and help control the flooding. There are lots of things that you can do now, which you see the importance for more strongly, which are still more attractive than in the past. And I think the management of the forests and the restoring of degraded land and the protecting of the water courses are a very big part of that story. Improving irrigation so that land productivity goes up and you don't encroach on the forests in the same way. I mean, let's remember how unstable that could become so quickly in terms of the viability of the forests as you encroach still further into them. So there's so many things you can do around land and water management, which is so much more important now. They were always important, but they're so much more important now that you could see, we would hope, a collective advantage in, so that societies come together around doing those things together. And that in itself could improve the governance story, the recognition of the importance of good governance, the recognition of mutual responsibility. So it could turn that way, but it does seem to me to be, as it were, within the system as to whether it turns that way or not. And community action, political action, strong civil services are part, I think, of the story of whether we turn powerfully in a very good direction or act slowly or not at all. And then it seems to me governance could get worse. Because if we don't act, the risks of conflict are intense. Climate change could produce massive population movements. That has already begun. It occurred in Syria, it occurred in Darfur, it's occurring in Nigeria, occurring in many parts of the world and many parts of Africa. And those kinds of population movements can lead to conflict, and conflict is about as bad as it gets for development and good governance. So if we act together, I think we could really rejuvenate, put power behind the whole development story. But if we don't, we could make it much worse.
Yeah, I can't resist but telling you a case that I did in the Zambezi Basin, which is south of Uganda. where this point about irrigation, as you rightly said, I mean, Africa is the least irrigated continent in the world. And as you said, the productivity of land goes up significantly with irrigation. And then, so we looked into did a benefit cost analysis of what it would take to increase irrigation in the Zambezi Basin by 25%. And it turned out that if you ignore climate change, the benefits and the costs are about the same. The cost of irrigation, because of all the governance problems associated with procurement and so on, makes the costs and benefits the same, which then might explain why there hasn't been more irrigation. But now, if you include the avoided costs of climate change from irrigation, because irrigation enables you to smooth the water supply when you're faced with droughts and floods without it, that increases the benefits relative to cost by a factor of 2. So climate change, the threat of climate change is what tips the balance in favor of more irrigation, which, by the way, is also will also increase agricultural productivity. So if we could get some of those cases going, and I'm sure there are some in Uganda as well, and I want to appeal to the people in this call, that I think you can be part of that movement of understanding the threats posed by climate change, but that threat can be used to an advantage of promoting good development, and certainly avoiding some of the hazards of climate change.
The Global Commission on Adaptation, Shanta, gave very powerful examples right across the world of how productive investment in adaptation really was. And of course, as you said, it goes way beyond simply the reduction of risks of climate change, because those things directly improve agricultural productivity. Now, when I first went to East Africa in the late 60s, it was only 2 or 3% of the land in Africa was irrigated. And I suspect it's not very much, it's higher than that now, but it's not hugely higher than that.
It's about 6%.
Yeah. So at the same time, I've been working in Indian agriculture, as you know very well, for 50 years or so as well. And in that time, the intensification of irrigation in Indian agriculture has been quite remarkable. And what's interesting is that it's in large measure been individual investment. Now, you've had the big schemes, but a lot of it has been the individual farmer or groups of farmers getting together to advance irrigation. And that's a question which I've always wanted to study or think about in relation to Africa, is the scope for individual action in irrigation, and how strong could that be? I've seen in Africa, of course, water harvesting and water management, which can be a big part of the story of managing water. But it would be very interesting to, and I'm sure so many people have looked at this, and I've just been too distant, but the way in which irrigation occurs, I think, is very important. And we shouldn't automatically think that it's just about the very big schemes, although some of them will have to be big.
Okay, that's a good segue. I want to now turn to the question of mitigation or reducing carbon emissions. And the question that's on my mind is Uganda today contributes 0.01% of global carbon emissions. That's 1/100th of 1%. So even if Uganda doubles or triples or quintuples its emission of carbon, it's not going to make any difference to the globe. The impact of Uganda by itself is tiny on temperature increase. So why should Uganda even contemplate that? Why not just go ahead and go about development, do all the adaptation you need to do in order to get good development, and not worry about the carbon emissions?
if you take a small country, you take a small poor country. If you take a small country, it will be a small part of the whole. So if you apply that argument everywhere across the world, then the obvious implication is that we'll be in very deep trouble 20, 30, 40 years from now. People argue that the UK is only 1% of world emissions. So, what if we make, what if we cut, what difference does it make? So I think the smallness is really a false argument in a story which is absolutely global and is looking a long way forward over time. But we all hope that the 2 billion people of Africa, 30 or 40, 50 years from now, will be very well off, at least much better off than now, and we're all gathered together to think about that development process. That will be a very big part of the world economy, and we hope it will be, and we work to make it be a big part of the world economy. And the right to development is surely fundamental. It's part of common humanity, and the duty to work together to promote development, particularly amongst poorest and most vulnerable places, is surely an obligation that we would hope most people would recognize. So the question is, what kind of development? And can we put together development, adaptation, and mitigation in a way that's good for all three? So I would begin by saying the smallness story just doesn't work in this context when this is a global public good and we're looking far into the future. The second is that it's an artificial horse race between development on the one hand and emissions reductions on the other. There's so much that we can do that puts all three of development, mitigation, adaptation together. There is a right to development. We're all looking to accelerate development, and development involves energy. So energy will be a very important part of that process. But energy does not necessarily involve carbon. And that's the key step in the process, that you can advance your energy as you advance your development, but that does not have to be high carbon energy. So that's the second part of the argument, that you can, and indeed we must as a world, put all those things together. I think the third part of the argument is that so much of the burning of fossil fuels is directly damaging, even if you put the climate to one side. If you look at the cities of the world, and I've spent very long periods in India, as you know, the cities of India are very, very dangerous places to breathe. We kill from air pollution in the world something close to 10 million people a year, in a death story of the world as a whole of ballpark 50 million or so. 15 or 20% of the world's deaths are associated with air pollution. Of course, those that don't die are deeply damaged by air pollution. It is immense. And water pollution, of course, is associated with the use of fossil fuels as well. But let me just focus on the air pollution. So that argument, in addition to the ones I've tried to set out, is actually enormously important. The cities of Africa are getting more and more congested and polluted. But if you go to the cities that run it forward a bit, go to the cities of, particularly of South Asia, but across the world, whether you look at Latin America or East Asia or many cities in Africa, that pollution is killing people on a massive, massive scale. I mean, 15 or 20% of world deaths and all the damage to health on top of that. Now, not all of the pollution is from burning fossil fuels, but a lot of it is. The majority of it is. So there are those benefits which are enormously important as well. You know, the going beyond the air that people breathe in cities, looking at acid rain, looking at the destruction of watercourses and the environment. These are costs of the fossil fuel-oriented approach to development, which are immediate, strong, and particularly damaging for poor people. So if you put all those arguments together and you put them with the opportunities. I mean, decentralized solar and hydro, run-of-the-river hydro or micro hydro, decentralized solar and hydro are enormous possibilities in much of Africa. So there are ways of producing the energy which will be part of the development story, which are highly relevant for Africa itself. So for all those reasons, I think to go down the fossil fuel road is just a deep development mistake.
Okay, no, I hear you. So the first argument, the first counter argument, is your classic public economics argument. Sometimes it's used on trying to explain why people vote. You know, you say my vote doesn't make, no election is decided upon by one vote. We all vote because if I don't vote and everybody else does the same thing as I do, then we will be in real trouble. And I think that's the same argument you were making about why even a small country like Uganda should work towards mitigation, because if all countries behave, said we don't matter for global climate change, then it will matter big time. So that's
and you're running it forward. You're running it forward over time as well. So
yes, exactly. So it can accumulate as well. Now, but I like this, the third point you made, because it actually flips it the other way around. That the benefits of mitigating climate change, particularly fossil fuel driven energy production, are local. It's the people in your own country who are being hurt by the burning of coal and so on. And that's interesting because many countries, I won't name names, use the argument, why should we invest in a global public good that benefits the rest of the world? And they undersupply the mitigation as a result of their view that there are poor countries and they don't need to benefit other countries who are much richer and may have caused more of the climate change in the past. But I think that argument also needs to be flipped on its head, because by burning fossil fuels, you're not only hurting the planet in terms of climate change, you're killing your own people.
Now.
The people living down the street.
You're killing them now, yeah?
You're killing them now, right? And in fact, there's a very nice paper by Ian Parry at the IMF where he calculates the externality associated from coal production, the externality associated with climate change, and compares it to the health externality associated with burning coal. And it turns out the health externality is actually bigger. So you could say, look, forget about climate mitigation. I need to do something about coal simply to improve the health of my population.
Yeah.
Not worrying about others right now.
If you have 3 or 4 strong arguments, they're not competitive, they're additive, and you have to put them all together. But we should emphasize the opportunity story. The alternative source, we do need energy for development. We absolutely do. But the alternative routes to that energy are plunging in cost, and they can be very inclusive. Decentralized solar can be very inclusive. They're plunging in cost, and they open up tremendous opportunities. So that's where we should be focusing on energy, where we should look to advances. We should look to how we can do them in decentralized ways. And that seems to be enormously attractive and where a lot of our attention should be. But let me make, because we're running to end of time, but I do want to make one point about finance, because the kinds of investments we're talking about, which do put development, adaptation, mitigation together. And let me remind you of the examples: restoring degraded land, managing our forests much better, public transport, decentralized energy, renewable energy systems. All of those put development, adaptation, mitigation together. But they all need finance. Of course, they need good design, just as the T project I described needed good design, good execution, but they need finance. And if you do put development, adaptation, mitigation together, then the global carbon markets could be of real importance. Now, we're starting to see with all the private sector firms, so many of the, not all, but so many of the big private sector firms in rich countries declaring for net zero, often in quite short time horizons. Over the next 20 years, they're going to have to buy offsets. And a lot of that will be through the voluntary carbon markets. So if you can put development, adaptation, mitigation together, for example, in restoring degraded land, or decentralized solar, or the forests, or indeed public transport, if you can put those together, then you have a package, a high quality package, that could gain finance on the voluntary carbon markets. And the great advantage of those is it's not debt. There's no debt service that you have to incur, which has been strangling so many developing countries. What you have to do, of course, is to deliver on the project, which is exactly what we want to do anyway. That's your part of the transaction. So I do think that if we put development, adaptation, and mitigation together, then the sources of finance will just be much bigger than they would be if we looked at adaptation alone. Now, there's a deep moral obligation on the countries that got rich on dirty development to help with adaptation. They've been a big part of the problem, and they have a moral obligation to help on that. So these voluntary carbon markets should absolutely not be an argument for slithering away from the obligation to help with adaptation. What I'm emphasizing is that this is a new source of finance, which, if mitigation, adaptation, development put together, could be strong. And thinking through how one responds to that source of finance will be very important. But it will depend on putting development, mitigation, and adaptation together.
Absolutely. I think the argument for carbon financing or financing through the carbon market are very compelling for the reasons we've talked about today. That there's such an intimate connection between mitigation, adaptation, and development that as an economist, I would say, it's surprising that it hasn't come up already. That it isn't as big as it should be. This is the $1 million on the sidewalk that we're leaving untouched. So absolutely. That said, so let me end with just what is a controversial topic, which is, and you want the countries that take these finance to still practice good development in the terms of least cost options and the most productive options. But then I see that some countries are also then putting in bans, say no financing for gas projects in Africa or in low-income countries. I think the Netherlands and Norway maybe have done that, who, by the way, have their own gas projects in their own countries. Isn't there a contradiction there? If you want the least cost options, and sometimes moving from coal to gas could be a huge carbon saving, and it could be part of the transition into renewables. Then these bans on financing for gas projects don't make much sense.
It's clear that gas can be part of the transition process of movement away from coal. But what we're seeing now, I think, is an expansion of opportunities in renewables, right across the board on the renewables, whether it's solar or wind or hydro. An expansion of the opportunities there, which is absolutely remarkable. So it actually, in my view, makes a lot of sense to focus attention on those things which are the technologies of the future, whose costs are driving down. And so I would recognize that in some circumstances there's a transition argument of going from coal to gas. But I think the movement of costs and movement of opportunities has changed so much in the last 10 or 15 years, that moving very strongly, I think, towards the new technologies makes a lot of sense. So I would put it in terms of good development and looking to the future. We do have to finish now,
Yes.
Shanta, but there's one thing which, let me just note that we could have talked so much more about other parts of this story. And one part of the story that we could have talked much more about is Africa's cities and towns and how they develop, and the importance of making the right investments now, not to lock in congestion and pollution, including, of course, emissions for the future. There's so much more we could have discussed, but I didn't want to let that one go, because how Africa's cities develop is absolutely vital to the development and future of the people of Africa, obviously, but also to the way emissions move. And of course, resilience, because within cities, it's the poorest, weakest areas of infrastructure that are most vulnerable to the violent weather and climate associated with climate change.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because we also didn't discuss my favorite topic, which is if you're trying for resilient infrastructure, the focus should be on maintenance of infrastructure rather than new infrastructure. And that's something, again, traditionally we have underinvested.
Yeah.
And we need to move towards greater maintenance. And there are studies that show that you can develop 95% of the risks, you can mitigate 95% of the risks just by increasing maintenance of infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I know you have to go, Nick, so let me thank you for fascinating treatise on the, shall we say, the tripartite agenda of development, adaptation, and mitigation. And I hope that the people in the audience got enough knowledge, but also inspiration that we need to work on this together. And I hope that we can, in a few years, get back together to see how much progress we've made, because I think this is also a unique opportunity for a country like Uganda to show some leadership in the area of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So thank you very much, Nick. Very nice to see you. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Shanta. I say it was 55 years since my first visit to Uganda, and it would be wonderful to get that back there before too long. But thank you very much for having me and for allowing me to participate. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Shanta. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause. Big round of applause for Nicholas and Shanta. Thank you so much for the conversation. It was quite exciting, and we want to thank you so much. And for those of you who have not done your Google on Professor Nicholas, he's the IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, and also Head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. We want to thank you, Nicholas, for your participation in today's Economic Growth Forum, and also Shanta, who is a professor of the practice of development at the Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He was previously the Senior Director of Development Economics and a former acting chief economist of the World Bank Group. So I want to thank both of you, Nicholas and Shanta, for a job well done. We will now take a very short break and take a coffee break. That coffee break will lead us into our parallel sessions. If you could turn to your program, you'll notice the next sessions will be happening in 3 simultaneous rooms simultaneously. So we have session that will be happening here, the session under trade industry, using trade to drive recovery. Session 2 will be here in the Victoria Hall. So those of you in that space, please do stay in this room. After your coffee, come back to this room. And the other session, session 3, working towards an inclusive economic growth recovery, will be in Atra Room. So you take the stairs up and then on your right. Atra Room is where that conversation will be happening. It's already set and awaiting your presence, and the chairs will lead you through that session. And the other session, which is session 4, Uganda's growth strategy in context of the global green growth agenda, will be in Addis Room. Addis Room is actually the first room you'll see upstairs as you walk up the stairs. That's the first room. Atra is into the corridor as you go to Katonga Hall. So those rooms are available and ready. I am hoping we can have a working coffee. So if you can pick the coffee and a bite and walk to these rooms so that we can actually start at about 11:55. So 11:55 until 1 p.m. Now 1 p.m. we'll break for lunch. Lunch will be in Katonga Hall, and the chairs will also let you know where Katonga Hall is in case you're not sure. But in a very special way, allow me, and I know this is also for Isingoma, who will be handling some of our VIPs. With us is Honorable Kefa Chiwanuka, who is the chair of the Committee of Finance. Is Honorable Kefa here? I had seen him here, Honorable Kefa Chiwanuka. He was here, he's the chair of our committee. And also Honorable Paul O'Mara. Honorable Paul O'Mara is from Otuke. He's the Otuke constituency member of parliament. He's also here with us. We also, I think a short while ago, I've seen the tallest man probably now in this room after Ramadan. Or before I come to you, let me go to the old prof. Professor Ephraim Kamuntu, the Senior Presidential Advisor on Manifesto Implementation. So Isingoma, I'm showing you the VIPs, huh? And all the others, you know yourselves. But in a special, allow me to recognize the Director General Uganda Investment Authority, the tallest man probably in this room. Also recognize, I had seen him here, I don't know if he's still here, Major General Sam Kavuma, Operation Wealth Creation. He was here. Yes, please stand for recognition. The Deputy Coordinator, Operation Wealth Creation. And I also know that we have our friend who is, has a framework with the ministry, and they work with the ministry on the budget adoption and also dissemination of this budget and making it more inclusive from the civil society perspective. The Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group, Julius Mukunda, is also here. I think I saw you. Yes, there you go. Enterprise Uganda is represented by Ochichi. That's part of Ministry of Finance. Yes, I saw him here. So these are the people I was showing you, Sungoma, inclusive of the others we had introduced who are here. So, Honorable Minister, mine is to request that you lead our VIPs to coffee. Isingoma will guide you on your way out. And please, let's have a working coffee. Pick your coffee and return to the room. You will be attending the next session. Good afternoon.